Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and this is another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. On Wednesday at 4 a.m. local time, a ceasefire went into effect, ending, at least for now, the 14 months of war between Israel and Hezbollah. It is tenuous and fragile, and the situation remains volatile. Under the agreement, within 60 days, Israel will withdraw from southern Lebanon. The Lebanese armed forces will deploy to the south. Hezbollah will not be allowed to rebuild and redeploy there, and the U.S. and others will oversee this mechanism. A side agreement between Israel and the United States provides the IDF with the ability to operate preemptively if it sees Hezbollah violating the agreement. To understand the view of the ceasefire from the U.S., I spoke with Elliott Abrams, the special envoy on Iran in the first Trump administration, the former deputy national security advisor in the George W. Bush administration, member of the JPPI board, an author of 5 books, chairman of Tikva, chairman of the Vanderberg Coalition, and a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Elliott was in the administration back in 2006 during the Second Lebanon War, which also then ended with an international mechanism of sorts under UN Security Council Resolution 1701. We discussed the difference between then and now and why maybe this time it will actually work. We also spoke about the incoming Trump administration, what the appointments made by the president-elect mean for Israel in the region, and also what Trump's policy might be on Iran. Have a listen. Elliott, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
My pleasure. Good to be back.
So we're talking at a very interesting time. Obviously, there's the transition that's going on now in Washington as the Trump administration begins to build itself and get ready for taking office on January 20th. And of course, the continued developments, obviously, here in the Middle East, especially on the Lebanon front with the ceasefire now going into effect. And of course, the Gaza war and what will happen there. But I'm curious, just from your perspective, obviously, with the Lebanese, the Lebanon front and Hezbollah, how much of this do you think has to do with what I've heard a lot of people start to refer to as the Trump effect, kind of Trump coming into office, the Iranians understanding that things are changing, maybe the Hezbollah understanding that things are changing and better to wind this down, maybe also for Israel, by the way, Israel understanding that things need to change and they also have to wrap this up. How much do you think it is a result of Donald Trump's election?
I'm inclined to say it's not primarily that. That is, if you envision, let's say Joe Biden had run and been reelected, the inducement for Hezbollah to try to get the bombing of Dahiya, of Shia areas, of them, killing of their leadership, that inducement was quite serious. The Israeli, obviously, desire to be able to push Hezbollah north toward the Litani and get those, 75,000 people back home, again, pretty large. So I would have thought it seemed possible anyway. I think there is a greater inducement on the part of both Iran and Israel to avoid the kind of unknown, unexpected. If it looks like it might be a good thing to do, get it done before January 20th and eliminate the unknown.
You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about the parameters of what the ceasefire looks like, and obviously different than the Gaza front. It's interesting always to contrast the two, but Israel, and when it comes to Gaza, had stated from the beginning it wants to eliminate Hamas, of course, wants to get back the hostages. There it seems to be having more of a difficult time, but the elimination of Hamas had always been the primary objective. When it came to Hezbollah, the elimination of Hezbollah was never really the objective. It was let's destroy and degrade as much of their capabilities in the south, create more security for the Israelis who you mentioned had been evacuated. But Hezbollah as an entity will still remain in the years to come. And I was thinking back to 2006 when you were still in your role as Deputy National Security Advisor and, of course, Security Council Resolution 1701, which on the one hand was supposed to do what we're trying to achieve also today, prevent Hezbollah from rebuilding. So why do you think, or do you not think, that this time it's going to work?
Yeah, just one word about 2006. You remember that Olmert immediately on day one of the war said, Hezbollah will be decimated, Hezbollah will be destroyed. A mistake for Olmert that Netanyahu has not repeated. There's been no, in a sense, escalation of war aims. There's been a lot more
Right.
damage to Hezbollah than anybody said would happen, but not the rhetoric about, just destroying and eliminating Hezbollah. What's different this time? Um, I think there was a delusion in 2006 that the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, and UNIFIL would work. That is, set it up, have everybody sign, you have a UN Security Council resolution, we're done.
Right.
Nobody is under that delusion anymore. Nobody believes. Let me put it crudely. Who's going to shoot at Hezbollah guys? Who is going to kill Hezbollah people who are violating the ceasefire? UNIFIL? No.
Mm.
LAF? No. IDF, period. So Israel, quite intelligently, it seems to me, is saying to the US, the outline of the deal can be essentially the same, but we have to have the right to enforce it because nobody else is going to enforce it. Look, part of the deal is the however many Shia, a million, who knows, who have fled from South Lebanon north will be able to go home. Now, in the midst of them, there'll be plenty of Hezbollah people. Man, it's just obvious. Hezbollah will start testing how far they can go. I think, if not immediately, within weeks or months. So somebody's got to enforce it. And I think that's the critical difference. No, nobody believes UNIFIL or the LAF are going to do it.
Do you think, though, that what they're talking about is there's the letter that President Biden will be giving to Israel, basically saying from the American perspective, because obviously the Lebanese can't agree for Israel as part of an agreement to retain operational freedom and to continue to launch preemptive strikes as needed,
Right,
like in that scenario. You see Hezbollah now moving
right,
some rockets or digging a tunnel. But
right.
the American letter, I mean, how much of just a letter from a president is enough? I mean, obviously that's your closest ally, but
Yeah.
you know how the world operates. I mean, is that
Uh,
something that's going
we
to
know
be
how, yeah, we know how letters operate. Because there was the famous 2004 letter exchange between Sharon and George W. Bush,
right
2004. So
on the
2009,
settlement
Obama
blocks,
comes
right?
in, Obama and Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton says, "What letter?
Mhm.
There's no commitment here." Just completely forgetting about a letter that was not only letters that were not only exchanged, but Bush's commitments in that letter were then endorsed by votes in both houses of Congress. No, doesn't exist. Forget about it. The difference here, I think, is that in 2004, we did not know that Barack Obama was coming in 2009. Today, we know Donald Trump is coming in 2025. And it seems to me almost inconceivable that his reaction to such a commitment to Israel, yes, you can hit Hezbollah if they're violating the agreement, would be abrogated. I think it's pretty clear on the basis of Trump's rhetoric and record that he would say, yeah, sure, do what you have to do.
The one thing that I'm a bit concerned about, and I mean, you know Israel very well from all your years of working here in the region, is that also Israel, at some point down the road, it might not happen immediately, but in 2 years from now, we'll see something that Hezbollah is doing, and there will be people within the Israeli system and the defense establishment and the political system will say, nah, you know what? It's not worth, things are quiet. Tourism has returned. People are back in their homes. Let's contain it. Let's not do something. I mean, to me, that's my real fear is that it's going to, because at the end of the day, it's going to be a political decision. And
Yeah.
depending who's in political office here is going to have to make that decision.
We saw this in 2005 in the withdrawal from Gaza. Sharon said, now there is no tolerance. There's going to be no tolerance. All the Israelis are one rocket, and we're just going
Right.
to hit them very hard. Very shortly after the Israeli withdrawal at the end of the summer, Hamas began to shoot rockets, and Sharon didn't do anything. Then he had a stroke. He was back in office, but in the months before his completely debilitating stroke, which was 2006, early in 2006. He was still prime minister for maybe 4 months. And there was basically no Israeli response. So I think you're right to say this is going to require an Israeli decision. And it's going to happen early. Pardon me. Hezbollah will test it slowly but surely. Can we get some men in? Can we put some groups of men? Can we put men in uniform? Can we try to reestablish a base or a warehouse that Israel destroyed? What happens if a rocket is lobbed and it goes into Israel and Hezbollah says, no, well, that wasn't us, that was some Palestinian group. They'll do all of this. So you're right to say it's going to be a test of the government of Israel. And it's a democracy, so there will be lots of different voices in the government, in the opposition, in the IDF saying, hold on, that wasn't real. I think on the basis of what we learned in Gaza, the lesson should be hit them hard, hit them instantly. Hezbollah will test Israel. Israel has to meet that test by saying, we have an agreement. When you break it, you're going to get hit.
Right. So I want to talk to you more just generally about the incoming Trump administration and some of the policies that we saw. You were obviously a member of the last administration and you wore two hats then. It was the envoy on Iran and as well as on Venezuela. But let's talk about Iran for a moment. Venezuela is a bit too far away for me to have to think about.
Yeah.
But on the Iranian front, I mean, you mentioned earlier maybe the overtures that the Iranians are making. We obviously saw how the Iranians, prior to to the election on November 5th, they were threatening a retaliation to Israel's retaliation at the end of October, to the ballistic missile attack in the beginning of October. Now suddenly they've changed course and tone and tune, and they're not planning anything to attack. But that threat and that challenge for Israel and obviously for the United States still remains. What do you think the Trump policy is going to be on Iran?
I think the Trump policy is going to be what it was, which is sometimes said to be maximum pressure. The problem with that answer is that the maximum pressure policy did not have as a goal maximum pressure. Maximum pressure was a tool. Trump wanted a negotiation. He rejected the Obama deal, the JCPOA, because he thought it was, like so many of us did, I did, just a bad deal because it was time limited, because it didn't deal with missiles, and because it didn't deal with the proxy forces, support for terror. It was not comprehensive. Trump wanted a comprehensive deal. His view was that if we bankrupt them, particularly given the fact that they have a population that hates the regime, then maybe we drive them to a comprehensive negotiation. My guess, my view, my estimate is he's going to go back to that. So I think you're going to see an effort to reimpose the massive sanctions. Be harder this time, but I think you're going to see an effort to prevent any more money from going to the regime, an effort to freeze their accounts everywhere. But down the road, he's not at all averse to a negotiation if it's truly a comprehensive negotiation.
Is he averse, though, to using military force or to presenting the Iranians with a credible military threat? I mean, we all look back. When I look at, let's say, the Joe Biden administration versus the Trump first administration, there was obviously the strike and the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, that iconic Quds Force IRGC commander, which Trump carried out. There were people who warned him this would create backlash and retaliation, and that really didn't happen. And maybe it did show the Iranians that force is a possibility. Do you think that Trump has that in him in his second term?
I do. Just on the Soleimani thing, you may remember that when Trump was weighing the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, also recognize the Golan as Israeli, there were a lot of people, including his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who said, oh, there are going to be riots everywhere. Embassy is going to be overrun. You won't. All false. And then same thing with Soleimani. So I don't think he's scared by those warnings. And the backlash from Soleimani was almost non-existent. I do think that what he wants to avoid is not the use of force. It's what he would call the endless wars. The notion that he's going to have to send, 50,000, 100,000 troops. A strike like the strike on Soleimani, I think, perfectly plausible. And one way to test this out in, let's say, the first 6 months is, what does he do about the Houthis? Because that's Iran. The Navy, U.S. Navy and CENTCOM have wanted to do more and more. And in the last, let's say, month, maybe the month of November, actually, the U.S. has done somewhat more to strike the Houthis, but not enough. And we know, because it was leaked, that the head of CENTCOM, General Kurilla, sent a message back to Washington a couple of months ago saying, we're sitting ducks. Law of averages, sooner or later, one of those Iranian missiles shot by the Houthis is going to hit an American Navy ship, and sailors are going to die. I think when presented with that kind of thing, if you said to Trump, okay, we should invade Yemen and take it up. No, 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 no. But if you tell him, no, we're talking about airstrikes, more of them. I also think what's plausible is something Trump actually did in the last half of 2020 before the election, which is to threaten Iran. He told the Iranians that if a Shia militia in Iraq or Syria killed Americans, we were going to hit Iran, not hit the militia, hit Iran. And I think, that's the kind of message he's perfectly capable of sending. If an Iranian missile shot by the Houthis hits an American ship and kills Americans, we're going to hit Iran. Again, it's not a war. It's not World War III. It's not sending ground forces. It's airstrikes, basically.
Yeah.
Is he capable?
Remember the killing of I think it was 2 or 3 American soldiers in Jordan, all in an attack by Iranian militias, and the response was, like you said, against the militias themselves. There was never the direct attack against the Iranians, and that sense of immunity that the Iranians have received over the last 4 years is, I think, what's also led them to believe that they can just keep doing what they're doing and their illicit behavior and think they can get away with it.
This is it's not just Trump. I think, if you think of Clinton in Kosovo and Serbia bombing, or Obama and Libya, or Trump, Soleimani, I think there's a lot of presidents who, if the military says this is going to be a war and we're preparing 100, no. But if you come to the conclusion, this is a series of airstrikes. In fact, they're over by the time I announce them. Much more likely. Of course, it depends partly on, who are the advisors, what's the military advice he's getting. I mean, in the Obama administration, many, many times, what the U.S. military was saying was, we can't bomb in Syria because in order to do that, first we'd have to suppress all the anti-air defense. This is while Israel was bombing Syria every day and never lost one plane.
Right.
So it depends partly on what's the military advice you're getting. But I think if I were the Iranians, I would be recalculating now. This is not Joe Biden.
In general, the Trump administration, right? You look at Iran and you kind of outline for us what that path forward would look like. But obviously, they also have other interests. We remember the Peace to Prosperity plan that they had rolled out, which never really moved anywhere, but largely for a number of reasons. There was the Abraham Accords, of course, that came of it, but Donald Trump had outlined a path towards a Palestinian state, something that he could potentially bring back once again. And that's something that the Israeli government here would have difficulty digesting. I mean, what would you recommend to Prime Minister Netanyahu's government is maybe the best way forward with the Trump administration? Also, I mean, what do you think about some of these appointments that Trump has made? Because they're quite, they're in the very right-wing camp, I would say, of where Israel is politically.
Yes and no. I mean, you take Marco Rubio, maybe, and Mike Waltz, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. These are people you could see having served in previous Republican administrations. Rubio certainly kind of in the center of the Republican Party. I think one thing that's changed is obviously Gaza. And what I mean by that is not just that there's a war and there are maybe 100, well, what is it, 104 hostages. It's that no one has come up with a solution for Gaza. Here I am critical of the Biden administration. And one of the things I wonder about Trump is, will they try? What I mean by that is take the 5, 10 plans that are out there, which overlap substantially, and just try to call a meeting and crack heads. Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Saudis, Emiratis, EU, Rubio or Waltz calls the meeting and says, look, we need to set up some kind of government in Gaza. We need to set up law and order in Gaza. We're going to do it in the next 3 hours right here. Here's what you're going to do. I mean, previous secretaries of state, Jim Baker, Condi Rice, did things like that. Just basically, smashed heads together and said, we're going to get this done. We all know it needs to be done. Maybe Trump just stands back from that and instead says, let somebody else figure it out. This is not an American responsibility. Joe Biden obviously thought it was a kind of American responsibility, yet he didn't take the additional step of trying to come up with a solution. It just festered now for over a year. So that, I think, is an early decision for the Trump administration. Assuming that Biden gets a Lebanon deal, but not a Gaza deal, does Trump come in and say, okay, our job now is a Gaza deal. We need an interim government and an interim security force. I don't think he'll be, frankly, very enthusiastic about doing it because he doesn't want American military involvement. So the question that needs to be answered is, okay, no boots on the ground, no American boots on the ground. Who's going to do it? Again, what I asked about Lebanon, who's going to shoot Hamas guys? You think Egyptians are? Jordanians? No. Emiratis? Why would they want to do that?
Well, there's all that talk about defense contractors, right? I don't know how much you buy into that.
I buy into it a little bit in the sense that you could hire a security force, I think, to do discrete tasks. Guard this warehouse, guard that hospital, guard this border post, fixed posts, even start accompanying convoys going from, let's say, Rafah to that food distribution center. But overall, law and order of the kind that a police force brings, I don't think you can hire a mercenary force to do that in an area, small though it is, an area as large as Gaza. I don't think I've seen a real good solution to that without, well, you need probably some Palestinian police. I think part of the problem here is within Netanyahu's coalition, there's a complete allergy to any kind of role for the Palestinian Authority. But it would seem to me that some role, even if it's just legitimizing, blessing, koshering the enterprise, that's not unimportant for a number of the countries that might participate. But again, I think that's an early decision. How deeply do we want to get into that? When you start talking about re-establishing the peace plan that Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman helped negotiate, the world, in a sense, has changed, I think, changed too much for that. Israeli politics has changed too much for that. So I think one of the really big changes here, if you go back 4 years, the Saudi position has hardened considerably. I mean, the Saudis were, fairly malleable on what did they need on the Palestinian account. What words did Israel have to say? Much tougher position now, and it comes from MBS and the foreign minister. It's not, unnamed foreign ministry spokesman. They keep talking about establishing a Palestinian state. If, as I assume, that won't fly in Israeli politics, draw the Venn diagram of what the Saudis say they need and what Israel can offer. I don't see an overlap right now.
Do you think that Trump cares enough about Saudi Arabia and this normalization or integration with Israel that he would really invest what's needed in it? For example, what the Saudis are asking for, a defense pact, an alliance, and it could run into trouble in the Senate, right? Because you need a special majority.
Yeah.
And if it's Trump bringing it, what would the Democrats do? But if we put aside that technical challenge, does Trump is it, I mean, it does kind of, I would think, fit into the overall narrative. This is a continuation of the Abraham Accords. That's like my flagship or hallmark foreign policy achievement. Why not keep that going? On the other hand, like you said, the Saudis are a little tougher today in how
Yeah.
they're talking.
I think he would like to do it. I mean, the Abraham Accords were his greatest diplomatic achievement. I'd say that and getting NATO countries to start spending a lot more, billions more money. So I think he would like to do it because he doesn't have Jared Kushner. Kushner said he'd be an advisor, but I don't think he plans to spend, 300 days a year on the road. He has Mr. Witkoff, who has said that, who is a real estate guy who has said, this is a real estate problem. I think what needs
Reminds
to,
me of someone who once said that.
yes. I think what needs to happen once they come into office is, maybe it can happen during the transition. President Trump or the National Security Advisor or Secretary of State has to sit down with MBS in private and say, President really wants to do this again. What are we talking about? What do you actually need? What are the words that, I mean, we understand. I mean, my assumption is, why is MBS saying this? Domestic pressure,
Sure.
unlike the Emirates and Qatar, which have essentially no population. Saudi Arabia does. It has over 30 million Saudis, and they all watch Al Jazeera, and they have been taught that Israel is destroying Gaza deliberately, killing people deliberately, genocide. So there is public opinion pressure, and the government is responding to it by saying Palestinian state, Palestinian state. So the question to ask is, what do you need here? And then again, talk to Bibi in private. What do you need? Is this going to blow up? Is saying ABC going to blow up your coalition? Could you get a different coalition? I mean, another thing that's changed really is post-Trump came the judicial reform crisis in Israel, and now the Haredi draft reform. And Bibi's going to have to figure out on the Palestinian front what can he do now? I mean, that's a third separate vector
Oh, yeah.
of things that could blow up his coalition.
I don't even know. Yeah, I mean, I don't think he can at all say a Palestinian state. If he says those words, he's done. Smotrich, Ben-Gvir pull out. But I wonder if he could say, I'm committed to a diplomatic process with the Palestinians. I wonder if that's a little pariv, but I'm still not sure that that would fly with these guys. But I mean, he's going to have to figure it out. And I wonder if he presents them with annexation and you throw that into the mix, we're going to annex settlement blocks. We're going to annex Area C, whatever it might be. They get annexation. He gets to say diplomatic process and Saudi. Maybe that's something they can all live with.
Maybe, but the word annexation is what led to the deal with the Emirates. That is freezing annexation. Do the Emirates now feel, oh, you're trying to sell us the same rug twice. You will annex, you won't annex. I mean, I think many people thought the Abraham Accords were going to be impossible to do. It was simply too complicated. It's 10 times more complicated today, I think, to expand it in terms of Israeli domestic politics and in terms of regional politics due to the war in Gaza. I don't know. There are forms of words. Yes, we have believed since the Peel Commission report in partition. The question is the nature of that Palestinian entity. We don't want a one-state solution, and we will negotiate over that Palestinian entity. Does that do anything for anybody, or does that just make everybody angry? These are the preliminary discussions, I think, the Trump administration needs to have with the Saudis and with the Israeli government.
And if there's any one who's the magician here to pull off the political gymnastics of it all, it would be Benjamin Netanyahu, the guy who
Yeah.
seems to always pull through. I want to ask you, just as we wrap up, in general, I mean, there was a fear with the Trump administration and the selection of J.D. Vance at some point, and just in general, put America first, was that this was going to be something of an isolationist. And you've done a lot of work kind of within the Republican Party, obviously through the Vanderbilt coalition, which you chair, of really trying to keep the Republicans engaged on the foreign stage, but keeping a very strong foreign policy position and arm or leg in the world. What do you make of, when you look kind of the bigger picture here? It doesn't seem like those fears of we're pulling away from the world are coming true.
I think that's right. And I think that if you look at Trump's appointments, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, that is Minister of Justice, which is already dead, the sort of more extreme appointments are not in foreign policy. Mike Waltz for National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. These are not extreme appointments. And Trump never was, obviously, an isolationist. Look at the Abraham Accords. I don't know what he's going to do about Ukraine. And I think the worries about Ukraine and about discontinuous policy there are very much justified. But in terms of the Middle East, first of all, there's the tie to Israel and the enormous support for Israel among the American people and particularly within the Republican Party. And I would say the same thing about Asia. I mean, nobody is under any illusion about what is the great challenge to the United States and the American-led international system in this century. It's China. So I don't think one has to worry about the sort of, if you will, the excessive pivot to Asia where you try to abandon the Middle East. Trump is very interested in the Gulf, always has been. Never would make the kind of mistake Joe Biden did. We're going to turn the Saudis into pariahs. So I am not concerned about that at all with respect to Asia or the Middle East. I think there'll be a very deep involvement with the state of Israel, and the people he's appointed are lifelong supporters of Israel.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, it'll be interesting, Elliott, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good conversation. Very happy to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for joining this week's episode. You can find us always Mondays and Thursdays on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and of course, the Times of Israel's website. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom, a quiet weekend, and a happy Thanksgiving to our listeners in the United States.